Hello everyone, and welcome to our second Scientific Society talk. Today we are joined by Dr. Pam Berry, who will be talking about the challenges and opportunities of climate change for biodiversity. Pam is currently the co-leading the chapter on the natural environment and natural assets for the UK government's third climate change risk assessment, and has frequently been involved in evaluating projects for the European Commission, European Science Foundation, and various other international organizations. Her research interests include impacts of mitigation and adaptation measures on biodiversity and translations of science into policy through stakeholder engagement. If you have any questions for Pam during the talk, please feel free to write them in the comments section. Pam, thank you so much for coming. I will now hand over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk. I'm very aware that you've probably got a diverse sort of background, and so I'll try and make it accessible to everybody. But what sort of prompted the title for this talk is I'm aware we hear a lot about climate change and we hear a lot about biodiversity. And very often it's from a particular perspective. And so what I want to do this evening is to think about some of the challenges, but also the opportunities posed by climate change for biodiversity. So this is a rough outline of my talk. I'm going to try and cover what we know about current climate change and the state of biodiversity, and then think about what we think the future might look like with regards to our climate and what this might mean for biodiversity, before bringing those two elements together and showing how they're linked, particularly in some of our responses to climate change, before thinking about, well, what are some of the ways forward and how can we really take these two aspects of global challenges together. So first of all, what do we know about recent climate change? If you look at the graph on the left-hand side, which is taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report, you can see how changes from a baseline of average 1961 to 1990 have altered, and you can see how the 1980s, 1990s and 2000s have been much warmer than that 30-year baseline. And so we know that global temperatures are increasing. And if you look at the figure on the right-hand side, you can see what might be some of the causes of these increases in temperature or increases in the greenhouse effect. So on the top graph, you've got increases in carbon dioxide shown in green, increases in methane shown in orange, and increases in nitrous oxide shown in red. My apologies if you struggle with different colors like that, but this was not my choice. But you can see how, particularly from the 1960s, these greenhouse gases have been increasing in concentration, some might say exponentially. And then if you look at the bottom figure, you can see how changes in various human uses of fossil fuels shown in grey, and how changes in land use practices have altered. And you can see again, it's particularly our use of fossil fuels, cement and so on that have increased. Now, just because the increases in greenhouse gas emissions can sort of match temperatures doesn't mean that they're causal, but there is a very strong relationship, and based on what we know of the physics of the atmosphere, it is highly likely that humans are causing the changes in climate that we're seeing at the moment. So much for the climate. What do we know about the state of biodiversity? If we take the biodiversity equivalent to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, we can see on this figure here how a whole range of species groups are at risk of global extinction. And if we take various sort of categories of threat, we can see how particularly conifers, dicotyledonous plants, amphibians, and cycads, as shown by the orange part of these graphs, are particularly at risk at the moment. So we have two challenges. We have the challenge of climate change. We have the challenge of biodiversity not being in a good state, and the possibility of loss of species. But are the two related? Well, this figure, also taken from the Global Assessment of IPBES published last year, summarises what might be the drivers behind this state of biodiversity. And perhaps if we sort of focus on the direct drivers on the state of biodiversity, we can see essentially there are 5 main drivers. One is land use change, as was shown on the figure looking at climate and showing how forests and other land uses hadn't changed much. There's direct exploitation through using land and for agriculture or exploiting marine resources. There's climate change, there's pollution, and what are called alien invasive species, new species that come into an area and take over. So actually, if you look at this in the current state, climate change, it's shown by the orange bars, is only one of a number of drivers of the state of biodiversity. And we shouldn't lose sight of this, and it's something we shall come back to at the end of the talk. But if you look towards the future, then climate change is reckoned to increase in its significance as a driver of the state of biodiversity, and particularly its loss. So that's a sort of global perspective, but given that we are in the UK and we have extremely good records and a lot of research on climate change and biodiversity going on in the UK, and particularly here in Oxford, I thought I would also just put in a UK perspective. So here you can see how the abundance of 214 indicator species has decreased over the last sort of 35 years, and how the distributions of species have changed over the same period. But I think the important thing that I want to bring out from this figure is the fact that while overall trends in abundance have decreased, there are some species which show quite a strong increase in abundance, or just as you've got species that have decreased in their range within the UK, as shown by the blue bars, you do have species that are increasing. So you have this challenge of species loss and declining state of biodiversity on the one hand, but you also have these opportunities. It's not all bad news, which is something quite encouraging to hear at the moment. So that's the current state. What about the future? Here you have another figure taken from the IPCC report showing possible increases in different greenhouse gas emissions, and these are very dependent on the actions that we take at the moment. So in some senses, the future, and particularly the longer term future, is in our own hands. And this is shown nicely by this graph. So if we keep increasing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, showing by the increased numbers here, then you have increased warming, likely. So we do have a real challenge in front of us if we want to avoid increases of possibly up to 8 degrees C by the end of this century. Not that I shall be here to see it, but maybe some of you will. So we have a real challenge of potential future climate change, but what does this mean for biodiversity? And this is a mega piece of modelling that was done to look and see how the climate space or the suitable sort of climatic conditions for over 30,000 species might change under different levels of global warming. Now, it is modelling, so it's not precise and it doesn't include everything. But nevertheless, it gives us an indication shown by the orange bars of the proportion of these species across different groups that might lose more than half of their geographically suitable climate space. Now, the species will not only be losing suitable climate space, they will also be gaining it, as shown by the way in which some species were increasing their ranges even at the moment. But this implies that the species can move into this new climate space, so they need to be able to move. And where we've got enough information, and you can see how far species can move, as shown by the blue bars, you can see that a number of species will not be able to fulfill their new suitable climate space. And if you start adding in other factors like habitat availability and so on, then you've got even more problems. So we have a real problem with the future for species. If we have a quick look at the UK, we have some really good modelling of future projections. Some of you might be glad to know that it's going to be even warmer in summer, and that might be good if you want to holiday in the UK. But it means we will also have more extreme weather as well, and there was something about that in the newspaper only today, which was very nice of them. If we look at patterns of precipitation change, then you've got very different patterns of precipitation, with large parts of the UK projected to have decreases in summer precipitation, hot or dry summers. Some might see as a nice opportunity, an opportunity for tourism, but actually potentially more winter precipitation. So you've got these sort of two sets of changes going on, which biodiversity and species are going to have to adjust to. So it's not just a matter of warmer temperatures, but possibly warmer summers and warmer winters, but then drier winters and drier summers and wetter winters. So species have real challenges ahead of them, and I don't think we can even begin to successfully predict what really this will mean. But some people have made their best estimate, and this is looking at the UK and the proportion of species that might be at risk from climate change, or again, as you might notice, might have an opportunity. So if you're looking at areas of opportunity, if you want the positive side, then it's these sort of purple bars. And you notice there are lots of opportunities on the coast where species might be able to move in response to climate change. On the other hand, you also have quite a number of areas, particularly in the upland, where species are at risk, high risk, because they can only move upwards so far before they run out of space. And also they're going to be possibly outcompeted by species from lower down moving upwards. So where have we got to so far? Just to have a quick sort of mid-talk summary. I think we've established that climate has had and will have an impact on biodiversity. I think that's undoubted. We've got more than enough evidence on that. But as I said, climate has to be seen in context, in that it's only one of the factors that's affecting biodiversity both now and in the future, and affecting its ability to adapt in the future. Something else I think that's very important to remember is that the impacts of climate change will vary. It will vary according to what we do about our greenhouse gas emissions, because that will affect how much climate change there will be. There'll be geographical differences in where species might be more challenged or where the opportunities might be, but also species and habitats will vary in how climate change impacts upon them. So throughout all of this, we have to think about, are we dealing with challenges or opportunities? And what is the balance between them? And which perhaps do we need to be most concerned about? So the challenges, as I've said, for climate are not just about the means, but about seasonal patterns and extreme events. For biodiversity, it's about how climate change affects their responses, and climate change can affect the physiology of species, so things like respiration rates. It can affect their behavior, so things like time of egg laying, nesting habits, and so on. It can affect their phenology, and this is really about timings of life cycle events. So in the phenological calendar at the moment, we're just going through leaf fall, but we've got plenty of evidence that certainly in temperate parts, spring is arriving earlier and autumn is ending later. And you've got changes in distributions which lead to competitive interactions, and all that leads to changes in species which make up habitats, which affects ecosystem functioning. I won't say I could go on ad infinitum, but the complexity of the responses of biodiversity are quite a challenge. But as I say, you've also got these other drivers which are impacting those responses. And so we shouldn't forget about those if we want a complete picture of how climate change and other drivers might impact on biodiversity. But one shouldn't forget that biodiversity itself also affects climate, because species are obviously respiring, and you have transpiration, so they can be affecting carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. They can be affecting moisture in the atmosphere. They can affect how much of the incoming solar radiation is reflected. But the thing that's really attracted attention is the amount of carbon that's stored by biodiversity and by its productivity. So it's not all one way. So let's look at this a little bit more and think about how biodiversity does and could affect climate change. So if we look at the global carbon budget and how it's sort of divided up, basically anything above the line are emissions of carbon dioxide, and anything below the line as storage of carbon dioxide. So here we are sort of back with this sort of brownish coloured and grey lines, which we saw on the slide about current climate change. And you can see that the main emissions are coming from fossil fuels and industry, with some coming from land use changes. But almost an equal amount to what's being emitted is being stored by the atmosphere, the land, and the oceans. And so the amount that's increasingly stored in the atmosphere is represented by the emissions that we've seen on the graphs that I've already shown. But actually, about half of that is also stored in the oceans and the land. So the ocean and the land make up a really important part of the global carbon budget and affect how much climate change we might experience. And again, this varies across different ecosystems. So if you have a look at this, you can see again here on the right-hand side how important temperate oceans are in their storage of carbon. And not surprisingly, deserts don't store much, but forests, tropical rainforests, and some of the boreal and temperate forests are also important in storing carbon, not just in the biomass, but also in their soils. And if we look at this slide for Europe and Central Asia, again, you can see how important ecosystems like forests are in Europe as a whole for storing carbon dioxide. And again, the main emissions actually come from our agricultural land. So we have a sort of science link between climate change and biodiversity. But I think what's also important is to think about the link from a policy perspective. And actually the links between climate change and biodiversity have been around for at least 10 years, if not longer. So I've put here two important sort of quotes, and certainly the one at the bottom is one which I often quote, which came out of a meeting of environment ministers in Athens in 2009. Which says, we cannot halt biodiversity loss without addressing climate change, but it is equally impossible to tackle climate change without addressing biodiversity loss. And this is a message that's really been picked up over the last 2 or 3 years at the international level. The idea that we're not dealing with two separate issues, but actually two very related issues. So in some senses, we have a challenge, but also there's an opportunity by bringing these two together and seeing what can be done if we tackle them together. So one of the things that's attracted a lot of attention, and certainly we're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the policy forum, and if any of you have been following the Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or the COP26, which was to have been held in Glasgow next month, but has now been postponed for a year. One of the things that the international community and also the UK, who are hosting it, have pushed for is something called nature-based solutions as part of addressing climate change. Now, nature-based solutions under that sort of umbrella term is probably relatively new, probably about sort of 10 years old. And they've been defined by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. It's quite a mouthful. So what I want to do is to unpack that a little bit, because they are certainly being seen as a possible way forward to dealing with the challenges and opportunities of climate change and biodiversity. And in fact, the UNEP went as far as, that's United Nations Environment Programme, went as far as to suggest that they offer the best way to achieve human well-being, tackle climate change and protect our living planet. Quite a bold statement, but it's one with which I have some personal sympathy, and it's something we are certainly going to be hearing a lot more about in the coming years. So let's think a little bit more about the conceptualization of nature-based solutions. The IUCN in this sort of graphic on the left sort of centers on these societal challenges and looks how nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches tackle these societal challenges which lead to human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Whereas this one, which comes from Natalie Seddon, so based out of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which is in zoology, has biodiversity at the centre, and then you sort of work outwards to nature-based solutions. But if you take the definition and divide it into these three areas, I think there are these three elements need to come together to get nature-based solutions. So they're about addressing societal challenges. They're about taking actions that actually help biodiversity through ecosystem-based action, and that they provide benefits to humans, to their well-being, and, as I said, to biodiversity. So why are they being seen as such a solution? Well, I think it's because they can address a whole variety of societal challenges. I've put at the list at the top here, climate change and adaptation, but often they can deal with flooding, coastal protection, air and water quality, urban regeneration, public health, and so on. And the point is, very often, if you use them for one of these purposes or one of these challenges, you actually get these other benefits as well. So they have multiple benefits, and that makes them very attractive to addressing complex societal challenges. And here I have a slide just listing some of the sort of benefits, and not just the challenges they can address, but also the benefits that they can provide. And it's quite possible to see how they actually interact. So this is a very simple sort of schematic that I've drawn out, that if we take one of the suggested nature-based solutions, which is afforestation or reforestation, which has been suggested particularly to address climate mitigation. It's certainly very important in the UK. It's sort of part of the argument for suggesting how we might get to our commitment to net zero by 2050, and you saw in the last election different parties promising to plant so many millions of trees under sort of different time periods. So it's an action that's often undertaken in order to address climate mitigation, but actually trees and therefore forests are multifunctional. So if you actually do plant trees, they will slow down floods and movements of water. They will prevent soil erosion. Depending what species they use, they will enhance biodiversity. It's quite possible to plant different sort of ecotypes or different sort of genetic varieties as well. Trees also provide timber. They provide an opportunity for recreation and for people to engage with wildlife. And probably the only sort of negative is the fact that they do take up water, and certainly in areas that are water challenged, then there may be an issue with decreasing water availability, perhaps for public supply or for industry. But certainly they are a very interesting possibility for a way forward. And there's been a lot of interest, as I say, at the international and the national level on what is the mitigation potential of nature and various aspects of nature. And there's been a very influential paper that was published by Griscom et al. In 2017, looking at actually how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases could be taken up or stored by different actions. And these were actions that could be taken that would not compromise our need for food and fibre, and would not involve encroaching on protected areas. And here you can see there are a whole range of suggested actions that could be taken. And these little small coloured bars show what some of the other benefits might be. So actually, many of the actions which involve forests have a high climate mitigation potential and could produce a number of benefits, as I showed on the other slide. Similarly, wetlands, whether you're talking about sort of coastal salt marshes or mangroves, or whether you're talking about peat and peat restoration, they too have reasonable mitigation potential. Agricultural is a little more debated about, but Griscom et al. Estimated that sort of globally these various actions had the potential to produce about 30% of the mitigation that we needed to keep warming below 2 degrees C, and to do so in a cost-effective way. So it's not surprising that they attracted a lot of attention. A lot of people are very concerned about this, though, because if you do go for widespread tree planting, actually what impact might it have? So there's a lot of debate at the moment about what trees should be planted where and what the impacts would be. But the other thing which people became very concerned about, it was felt as though these sort of nature-based solutions, or what are called natural climate solutions, had the potential to deflect the sort of spotlight from the need to decrease emissions. They sort of provided almost a get-out-of-jail-free card for those of you who play Monopoly. But also they detract from the need actually to deal with the other sort of 66% or whatever of action that's needed to deal with the issue of energy and energy usage, that sort of grey wedge that was on a couple of the earlier diagrams. So certainly nature-based solutions for climate mitigation have potential, but need to be applied with caution. So what about effectiveness of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation? And here there's a lot of evidence that they can be incredibly effective for climate change adaptation. And Alex Chausson from the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which I say is based in zoology, has just had published an evidence review on this. And if you want to have access to the evidence review, go and visit the NBSI website. But here it's showing the evidence that they could get on how nature-based solutions could reduce food losses, help to improve biomass cover, reduce freshwater flooding and so on. So there's a lot of evidence of the positive effects as shown by the green bars of nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. And the evidence is building daily. So nature-based solutions have potential to address climate change, or some of it, through mitigation and opportunities for adaptation. So increasingly, as shown by the earlier quotes about climate change and biodiversity, the two are seen as two sides of the same coin. And that was a phrase that was even used by our Prime Minister when talking about these two in the context of COP26. So essentially, for climate change, we need mitigation and we need adaptation. And to do that, we need to maintain and enhance our carbon stocks, most of which are in the land and oceans. So we need our biodiversity, and we need our ecosystems in order to enable us to better mitigate and adapt to climate change. So the two truly do need to go together. So coming back sort of to the policy dimension that I've already talked about a little bit. I mean, at the international level, you have the Intergovernmental Platform on Climate Change and the policy. Really, you've got the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. It was under that the Paris Agreement was signed. So that's on the climate side, and you've got the Conference of the Parties next year in Glasgow, COVID-19 permitting. On the biodiversity side, you've got the International Convention on Biological Diversity, which is looking to address biodiversity loss. But as it's sort of revising its targets and so on, it is very much bringing in nature-based solutions, as are talks around the UNFCCC. And indeed, there have been meetings between the two main sort of policy bodies, the UNFCCC and the CBD, to say, actually, how can we move forward together? But as I've been hinting at, climate change and biodiversity are also affected by other drivers which come under other policies. And actually, climate and biodiversity can not just sort of help each other, but they can also help deal with other policies, including the UN Sustainable Development Goals, many of which include elements to do with climate and biodiversity. So I think we're at a very interesting point where the policy is moving together in the same direction and coming closer together. And being somewhat of an optimist, I'm cautiously sort of optimistic that we might be getting somewhere at last. And just to emphasize that point about the way in which climate change, biodiversity and other agendas can come together, there's this quite complicated figure in the IPCC report on climate change and land, which looks at a number of options that are available to us as we seek to mitigate climate change or adapt to it, but also assesses how well it deals with other challenges like desertification, land degradation, and food security. So here you can see there are a large number of options based on land management, not all of which are really involving biodiversity, I admit, but nevertheless, there are actions which enable a number of global challenges to be addressed together. And the fact that you're even getting sort of figures like this, I see as quite encouraging that we're going in the right direction. So what are my sort of concluding thoughts? I still believe that despite sort of opportunities for biodiversity, climate change is a real challenge in its own right, and it's a real challenge for biodiversity moving into the future. Hopefully, I've shown that actually scientifically they cannot be separated from one another, and therefore they need to be addressed together in the sort of policy dimension. And also they need to be addressed along with other similar challenges. And I think we are at a point where people are recognizing that there are opportunities to bring different agendas together, to address them in similar ways. Obviously, not everybody can win everything. It's quite hard to get the win-win-wins. Nature-based solutions, I think, offer you a long way along that. But I think also it requires a different way of working. We can no longer work in silos, and we need a more systems-based approach where people are looking to address global challenges and not separating them out into individual global challenges, but looking to see how we can address everything together. And this is particularly challenging in the policy context. But I do think there's some really interesting moves afoot, and I'd be quite interested to come and give this talk in 10 years' time and see whether we made it. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm very happy to take questions.
So thank you very much, Pam, for such a fantastic talk, and hopefully we will see you in 10 years and before that as well, because I really enjoyed your talk. So now we've got a couple of questions for you, if we can bring them up, and then I can read them out to you. Just okay. So we've got one question from Anita, and she asks, how much could climate change affect other drivers of biodiversity? Could climate change drive an increase in invasive species in both in the seas and in woodlands and uplands?
Yes, thank you, Anita. I think climate change does affect particularly something like invasive alien species. because things tend to become invasive when they move into new areas, and it's then they're without sort of competitors. And certainly there's evidence that some species are moving in to the UK even, but not everything that comes in is invasive. And I think that's really interesting. I gave a talk once down in Kent and showed how the whip snake could have suitable climate space in Kent by 2030. And the audience were not certain they would like to have the whip snake. Thank you. Okay, I wasn't saying it's going to become invasive, but it's actually a really interesting point. But certainly looking at the climate change risk assessment, which I'm working on, then we do see a real risk of certain diseases and pests from, as a result of climate change.
Because I mean, for me, in my case, when I sort of think about new species coming or like invasive species, I immediately think of like the grey squirrel, which just totally sort of almost wiped out the red squirrels. But it's good to know that that's not always necessarily going to be the case with new species coming in.
No, only about 10% probably would become invasive. So we need to try and work out which ones those might be and to deal with them before they get here. The channel is really useful, so we can often spot them coming, through Germany and the Netherlands. Yeah. And so we do have very strict sort of sanitary controls.
Yeah, but I guess you have a bit more time to sort of deal with it before it necessarily escalates out of control compared to other sort of continental countries.
Yeah, if possible, but the garden trade is a real problem.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering the question. So we've got another one. Let's see. So this is from Sarah, and she asks, "What has COVID-19 done to the global ecological situation?" That's a really interesting one.
Yes, I mean that is incredibly interesting. I mean, that's a whole lecture in itself. I think there are a number of things I want to say. First of all, I think it's made people very aware of the relationship between humans and zoonotic diseases. It's interesting that China at least put a ban on trade in sort of wild meat. But having said that, I then saw responses from Africa who were saying, well, actually, many individuals, communities rely on bushmeat to have enough to eat.
Right, okay.
If you look at it in the UK context, then a number of reserves, wardens commented they saw far more of the sort of more sensitive species as a result of COVID-19. But it's quite interesting. If you search for Pledge for Nature, this is being promoted in advance of the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP, where a large number of countries have signed up to sort of try and build back better after COVID-19. Now, how that will translate into action is another matter, which is why I say it'd be good to come back in 10 years. But people are thinking, actually, what lessons have we learned? And are there things where perhaps biodiversity has benefited as a result of COVID-19? And, can we learn from that?
Yeah, I was thinking, I can imagine definitely like in areas where there's normally a very, very high amount of tourists, but potentially things have improved for biodiversity in those areas because there's just significantly less people traveling and sort of disrupting the natural environment. But I don't know, I haven't really seen that much data on that sort of thing. It would be interesting to look at that.
No, there was a master's student in the environmental change management course this year, I think, who was trying to do something on that for their dissertation, but I didn't get to mark it, so I don't know what their findings were.
But that would be cool to see. That would be one dissertation I'd read. Okay, so next question. Let's see what this one is. Okay, this is quite a long one from Avi. What is the current state of climate engineering / geoengineering to migrate climate change, or similarly, bioengineering and biobanking to mitigate biodiversity loss?
Well, that's a long one. Geoengineering, you probably need to talk to some colleagues in other departments in Oxford. That's not an area of it's not an area of expertise for me. I know some people put a lot of faith in sort of geoengineering. It may be part of a long-term solution, but I wouldn't put my sort of faith in it. And I think it only addresses, one part of the global challenge of climate change. As you can tell, I'm sort of very much pro sort of biodiversity and quite taken with nature-based solutions because it can address multiple challenges. In terms of bioengineering, I think that's sort of possible. It requires a change in people's sort of perceptions of what they consider natural. So some people are quite against bioengineering and would rather let nature take its course. But on the other hand, I don't know what you're including in bioengineering. If you're including things like sort of gene banks and so on, I think they have a role to play, but we'd do much better trying to get our act together and conserve in situ, I think, rather than going down sort of technological routes, which if we find that they're not successful, and in the meanwhile we've removed the last of the species or totally destroyed its habitat, it'd be really hard to restore or recreate.
Yeah, I imagine geoengineering it's much more difficult to get it to sort of address multiple issues in the same way that biodiversity methods do in comparison.
Yes, but as I say, I think we might need to look at it as part of the solution.
Yeah, okay. So I think we've got time for one more question. Let's see what this one is. Okay. So this one's from Piotr. Is there any hope for a global solution to climate change? How many countries would we need to convince? And I'd like to add on to that, what countries in particular do you think we might need to convince? Because obviously some countries have a bigger carbon footprint than others.
Yes, well, I think you probably know which countries we need to convince. It's the one time when it's comfortable being in the UK, because I think our commitment is incredibly challenging to meet. I also think there's some really difficult sort of ethical questions around, who's been responsible for the emissions so far, and how much we should let other countries go down the same route as us, or whether we can help them to shortcut, inverted commas, the dirty phase. I'd very much hope we could and move through onto renewables much more quickly. But sorry, can you remind me of the second part of the question?
Yeah, so how many countries would we need to convince?
I think we really just need to convince the really big emitters at the moment. So it's probably a relatively small number of countries, but we need to keep an eye on what other countries are doing. But actually, I think the emitters at the moment also have a large percentage of the world's sort of population as well. So I think if we could convince them. But I think there are sort of two aspects to that as well. I mean, climate change is a global issue, but as I write at the very beginning, it's important also to think about it perhaps as a more local issue. And so I think it's something we should all feel responsible for, because we can help to decide what greenhouse gas emissions pathway we have in the future. So I'm sometimes asked you, well, what can we do? Is it worth it? I think everything's worth it. Because if we all threw up our hands in horror and said it doesn't make any difference, that really doesn't help.
No.
So I think turn your stat down by 1 degree C on your heating and save. It's a ton of carbon a year. You can save yourself money as well. So that is a really cost effective. But I think every action counts.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, I was going to say, I think like having good infrastructure sort of helps as well, though, because I know, for instance, in Germany, I think you have to have like either double or triple glazing in all houses, which really helps not only bring down like heating costs, but also like the amount that you have to use, because the houses are just generally, they're much better insulated in comparison to some houses in the UK, where you still got single glazing.
Well, that's part of addressing the sort of 66% that you couldn't do with nature. And that really is the big elephant in the room, I think, which is why I don't want nature-based solutions to defect from what really needs to be done by transport, infrastructure and so on. Nature can do its part, but it is limited.
Yeah, for sure. Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. I'd love to carry on, but sadly, we have already hit 7:30. Thank you so much for such a good talk, Pam. This is a very interesting topic, and the way you presented it was very thorough and very insightful. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and tuned in, and we look forward to seeing you at our next talk, where we will be hosting Dame Athene Donald, who will be talking about a scientist's responsibility. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy your evening.